So deploying Django to Heroku. I like to start a lot of my talks with a Google image search result with whatever the topic is. And this wasn't necessarily the first result, but it was one of the first things. And I live under a rock, and I had never noticed that there's the unofficial Django mascot. So that's what this is a picture of. If you're curious and want to follow along, you can go to this bit.ly link, and all of my slides are there already for you. And this is also available after the talk. So Heroku is a platform as a service. So it's one of the as a service things, which is distinct from infrastructure as a service or software as a service. So there's a thin layer of application that allows you to push code to it, and then you can now host an application. So whereas AWS, Amazon Web Services, provides services for spinning up load balancers and security groups and virtual machines and every little piece of a server environment, Heroku is specifically about deploying an application. So if you've got Django code or Ruby code or whatever other language, you can push into Heroku and have an app launched. One of the things that I struggled with when I was getting started with Python and Django was, okay, now I've written a Django app, what do I do with it? So the reason I wanted to give this talk is to help the person that is having that same struggle say that this is one of the things you can do with your Django app and how you can move forward with it. So Heroku supports Python and then a bunch of other things. It really started as a Ruby project in 2007. And more recently, I was investigating and I found that you can also push Docker containers into Heroku and host those. So we do a lot of .NET Core work at Leaf, and I was surprised to find that theoretically we could run Docker containers that have .NET Core in them and host them on Heroku. For most PBJs, I like to assume zero knowledge about what you're coming into this with. This one's a little bit unique in that I assume you've already written a Django app, because you can't really deploy Django without having a Django app. And I assume here we've got a pip file, but requirements.txt also works. I was pleasantly found that pip file is the default, that if you've got both in your repository, a pip file will turn out. You'll see how this works in just a minute, assuming my demo is going to work with me, so we're praying to the demo guys right now. And some gotchas about how these work. It's not really a virtual machine that you get in Heroku. You get what's called a dyno. And dyno is basically a virtual machine, but they got to call it something other than a virtual machine. And on the free tier, you have a number of limits. And even really at each tier, you have different limits. So it's 512 for the basic slug size, which is how much disk space your code repository takes up once it's unzipped and downloaded from your source control repository. And then it gets a little bit bigger for higher tiers, but there's limits at every tier level, and then there's a link here for a whole long page of other gotchas and other limits from Heroku. So let me dive right into the Django app that I've got here. Since I mentioned that we've got the expectation that we've got a Django app, I decided to start with the first Django app that most everyone probably wrote, which is the Django tutorial. So this is the polls application. And I made a couple of changes to it so that it's more easily deployed. So for example, here's my pip file. So I've got some dependencies here. I also installed database URL, which allows me to use a URL syntax for specifying what database the application will connect to. I'm also using white noise for hosting static files. And I'm using Python and not legacy Python. I also created another prod settings file. So this is distinct from the standard settings file, which has kind of the base settings. And this one has additional settings for, down here at the bottom, I've got a number of security features that you basically can just copy and paste these from other blog posts to say this is how you actually secure your site. And then, of course, the configuration for white noise. So starting out here, we're in my repository. Can everyone read that okay? It's awfully tiny. It's awfully tiny. That's still not much better, is it? Let me go over to a console window. That might be better. Oh, was the contrast was too much? Gotcha. And that's still the problem, isn't it? Can I make the background black? That'd be great, wouldn't it? I can't even see my screen. See, the problem is that loses all of my other settings. Well, we'll just have to muscle through it here. I'm sorry, this is not going to be the greatest experience. I'm sorry? The dark theme. Gotcha. This was not part of my plan, I apologize. Does that look any better? All right. So kind of an interesting detail here that if you have a .env file in your root of your repository where you do a pipenv, it will automatically import whatever settings you've got. So since I've got it locally here, it automatically imported and assigned, for example, my environment variables that I had assigned here. And so from Heroku, I've already got the command line tools installed. Man, that's really hard to read up there. I'm standing right next to it, I can't read it. We create an app, and what this did was it modified my git config and added this Heroku remote. So now I have a new remote, and the git configuration is a bit out of scope for this talk, but suffice it to say that it gives you another place to push your code to. So that now, when I say Heroku master, it's going to start pushing this repository with my most recent commit up to Heroku, and it does a number of configuration things and setting up the environment and all these things. While that's doing its magic, we'll do some other things that you probably can't read as jokes while we're waiting for it to install a pip file and dependencies, pushing that all up to Heroku and setting it up for us. So my push failed, and that's because I don't have any environment variable set up. So I have a different script that I wrote here that does some things for me that says where my module settings should be and setting Django debug to false. And so now I can just do, and it does the things for me. And this is now pushing into Heroku, where my settings file should be, setting debug to false. And so now we can, I think, run Heroku open. So if we try to deploy again, and once again we have to wait for it to push everything up. The benefit of using Heroku is that you have this, easily, we just say git push Heroku master. I've got a shortcut here, an alias for git push, so I can just say GP. But even with typing git push, whenever you make a change locally, you commit it and you can push it, and you have new code deployed globally that you can just send someone a link. More recently, Heroku has added features for pipelines and a build pipeline so that you can run unit tests within Heroku. You can have a staging and a production environment. You can even have environments for individual developers to say that, I've got one change that I want Calvin to look at, and so I send him my 5-minute reminder that here is my app, and then once he approves that my 5 minutes are up, then I can push it to staging, and then more of the world can see it. And let's see. Oh, you know what I forgot to do? I didn't actually set the app name. That won't allow the allowed hosts. So this needs to happen right here. Off by 1. Thank you. No whammies. Big bucks. Oh, no. Oh, but you know what we did? We do have our app, we have our code out there, but we forgot to run migrations. So now we can run something on Heroku's platform and say, all right, Heroku, run me Python manage py migrate. This is telling Heroku, launch a dyno and run my migration tool that has the Django migrations that I had configured to run locally. So this has got the caveat too that if you're behind a firewall that has draconian egress rules that if you can't get out on port 5000, you might not be able to run that line. So now I have my polls app. So I can do one more thing for create a user and log in here. I mean, this is really more configuring Django. The app is running here, and you can see I've got my Django admin running here that I can log in. So, like I said, some additional tips. I don't know if everyone it's pretty obvious with how much better they are with using the shell than I am, but I like to have shortcuts for everything. So if you've got multiple apps, like you've got staging, you've got production, you've got your own local app, you start to have to specify the app name for every single request. So whenever you want to push out changes, you have to tell it what app you're trying to apply to. So I create, production and staging, for example. So I create aliases for HP that will type run Heroku, fill in what other variables that I've posted, so like running PG or running run, and then applying the app name. Similarly, if you want to run both like your main Django app plus a worker in the background, you can create a web.sh file and then put that in your proc file. So instead of running gunicorn, you would run web.sh here in your proc file that defines how your structure is going to run. Since I had to manually run migrations, it's one thing that I'm almost always going to forget, whenever I have to deploy code. So as part of your proc file, you could also specify this release attribute so that anytime you push new code, this command will be run. And so in my case, I can just say, always run migrate to say, whatever new changes you've got, run migrations. How are we doing on time, Calvin? Is that about it? Got a minute? I have a minute for questions. There's a free tier that you have, I think, up to 200 hours a month, or the expectation is that it'll be down for 4 hours a month, and then the pricing goes up from there. You get different levels for Postgres, and there are many, many, many add-ons that you can add to this. A big downside of the dynos is that you have no local storage, no permanent local storage, that is. So while you can use temp files, you can't actually save something and have it return the next time the app boots up, for example. So you have to use S3, or you have to use some other external storage mechanism for longer-term storage of files. Yeah, I didn't go into that. That's a good question. How do you set up connection strings and private variables and manage environments? That's essentially the question, right? So here is the app that we deploy, this Desolate Gorge. And so in here, I use environment variables for all of my secrets. And so that's what I did when I ran this thing. So these are environment variables that can be, in general, either secrets or things that you just want to set globally. Correct. Yep. And so then you can reveal them here. since I was using Postgres and since I'm using Heroku, it went ahead and created Postgres for me and set up this database URL. And so this database URL environment variable is what defines where the database is with a randomly generated username and password that you can't read from there. But Heroku manages all the keys, all the username and password for that, and cycles the username and password automatically for you. So as long as you're referencing a database URL environment variable, you'll have the most recent version pointed to your database.